What's up? Hello, everybody. My name is Katie, better known by my Twitter handle, Katie the Russian, which is relevant to what I'm about to say. Over the last 18 months, my parents, who still live back in Russia, have experienced not their first, not their second, but their third hyperinflation. And that was the first time they were truly prepared for this event. And the only reason why is because they had a true plan B in place, right? They already hedged against the geopolitical bullshit. They were prepared against the money printer going burr. So thanks to Bitcoin, they had the plan B and insurance policy, a hedge in place. And some of you might know me as a founder of Plan B Passport, where I help Bitcoiners to obtain second citizenship. But even that's not the Plan B I want to be talking about today. So you know that BitBlock Boom is the longest running Bitcoin conference in the world. And hell yeah. Now, the reason it is the longest running Bitcoin conference in the world because that was the only one that took place in a true depth of COVID. In August 2020, I believe we all got together in Dallas and had the time of our lives while the rest of the world was in a true state of crisis. And if you look at the definition of a crisis in a mental health world, is, let me actually read it. A crisis is when a person's behavior prevents them from functioning properly. In a state of crisis, you cannot think straight, you cannot prioritize properly, you cannot weigh the risks. But what I truly believe is, and that's my message here today, is a crisis ends when the system starts. And the reason we weren't the one joining the rest of the world in this true state of crisis is because we were prepared. We were already stockpiled on food. We knew the government tend to lie. What a surprise. We were hedged against the money printer going brr, and we were healthier than others. So we had system in place to mitigate those threats. So being here on stage today for this short period of time, I had nothing better to say other than take steps towards mitigating your risks. Identify the attack vectors you have in your own life and set the insurance policy in place. Put the tools in place to basically lower the effects of external factors, because it's better to have a plan B and not need it than to need it when it's too late. So that's, again, my message today. Be more of a sovereign individual as much as you can, and that's it. Thank you. And now I'm very excited to introduce the next speaker, a fellow female Bitcoiner, a fellow East European immigrant, actually, and an amazing journalist, the host of Coin Stories podcast, and anchor of Hard Money Show. Please, a round of applause for Natalie Brunel!
Thank you. Oh, keep it. Thank you. Thank you so much to Katie and to Gary and Kathy. This is my first time speaking at BitBlock Boom, so very, very grateful. Hopefully, I will be able to knock this out of the park since it's almost dinner time and you're probably hungry. First, I want to start with a poll. Who gets their news from online traditional news media websites? New York Times, Wall Street Journal, raise your hand. Who gets their news from radio? Who gets their news from independent podcasts or YouTube channels, Joe Rogan, Coin Stories, What Bitcoin Did? All right, wow. How about television news networks? Bitcoin Twitter or social media websites? Okay, wow. So this is very interesting because according to Pew Research, more than 60% of Americans polled most often get their news from online news media sites, mainstream news, and 78% said that they get it from television news. And that is really my background. Before I transitioned to working in Bitcoin full-time, having my podcast and education, I was a broadcast news journalist. I started very traditionally, local news market, tiny town, thousands of people, worked my way up to national, and I learned so much, but I felt really disillusioned the last couple of years because I felt like we weren't covering the stories that really needed to be covered. We weren't unraveling the truth about the financial system, and I learned about that because of Bitcoin. And we weren't asking the right questions. So I'm grateful to the power of decentralized media because I was able to start my own show, and just as a hobby, I created a platform where I was able to ask those questions and tell those stories. So today my presentation is about decoding Bitcoin's media narrative, why we haven't orange-pilled the masses yet, but we will. And so I want to start with the fact that it was a news headline that signaled a revolution. It was inscribed into the Genesis block, "Chancellor on the brink of second bailouts." So Satoshi could have chosen a quote from a book or a movie or something said by someone famous, but instead he chose a newspaper headline to be inscribed. And this headline doesn't just provide a very clear and undeniable timestamp marking the beginning of Bitcoin, but I think it also symbolizes a commentary on the fragility of the centralized financial system. And at yet another time, by the way, when we were facing economic instability around the world, but also by embedding this specific headline, I think Satoshi was subtly underscoring this very acute awareness that there is a great power that the media has in both recording history and also shaping prevailing narratives. Stories are very powerful. So I think the inscription actually shows that Satoshi knows that technology forges new paths, but it's really the stories that we tell and the histories that we record that give any kind of innovation it context, resonance, and lasting significance. So I think that the Genesis block with this headline, it doesn't just represent the birth of a novel digital currency. I think it's also really a canvas where technology and narrative begin to converge. And it's a meeting point of this incredible computer science breakthrough and a real-world event, suggesting that stories are really just as powerful as the technology itself. So let's take a look at the evolution of Bitcoin's media narrative, and let's first differentiate between mainstream, mass media coverage and the early mentions in more niche and tech-focused channels. So for instance, the tech website Slashdot featured posts about Bitcoin in July 2010, and that introduced Bitcoin to a lot of tech enthusiasts. Teppy writes, "How's this for a disruptive technology? Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer network-based digital currency with no central bank and no transaction fees." So Teppy was clearly onto something. But when you zoom out to the world of legacy newspapers and major networks, the first years of Bitcoin, 2011, 2012, they can be characterized as a mix of seeing Bitcoin as a novelty and then being extremely skeptical that it could have a lasting impact. So let's zoom out, more wide stream, wide publication. The first ever mention of Bitcoin in the broader news media, it's somewhat difficult to pin down, but first mention in the New York Times is July 2011. It was an article called "Speed Bumps on the Road to Virtual Cash" by Noam Cohn. And the article delved into the challenges and issues that Bitcoin faced as it started to gain popularity in a niche community, but of course it talked about its volatility and potential regulatory concerns. And we saw the same thing in another early and notable mention, which was "The Cryptocurrency," published by The New Yorker in October 2011. That was written by Joshua Davis, and it was really a deep dive into Bitcoin, but also the mystery about Satoshi Nakamoto. And it, of course, once again, it covered the concerns, the ways that it couldn't work, even though it seemed like an interesting revolutionary breakthrough. And I wanted to throw up this quote. Does anyone know who Judith Whelan is by chance? She was quoted in a very early New York Times article about Bitcoin. "A Hungarian woman, 33 years old, who sells pet accessories at the Critter Casual, was persuaded to accept the coins by her husband. I've sold 24 collars, 13 leashes, and one pair of disco knickers with Bitcoin. The first order I had was for 42 BTC, which was worth $40 at the time. But now those coins would be worth around 680. Originally, I had a fixed Bitcoin price, but now I do a conversion. Let's just hope that she kept on to her Bitcoin and that she does not have to sell dog accessories anymore. But this is an example of some of the quotes and the coverage early on that was going to change. So, 2013, now we have a turning point, a shift in media narrative. I would characterize this phase as dismissal, FUD, and just outright sensationalism. The stories of skepticism turned way more negative, and the headlines really tried to capitalize on some of the industry's growing pains at the time. It was very, very early, and those growing pains were used to paint a very dark story around Bitcoin. So headlines during this time focused on the volatility, the early crashes. The term Bitcoin bubble began to be used. Bitcoin was framed as a scam and a fad, and it was also associated with criminal activities, especially when the Silk Road was shut down by the FBI. And in 2014, the collapse of Mt. Gox, which was a major Bitcoin exchange. Maybe some of you had exposure there. And it led to stories about Bitcoin's instability and also major security concerns. And it was back in 2013 that Paul Krugman, our favorite economist, wrote the piece, "Bitcoin is Evil," for the New York Times. And I would just like to remind people, he also thought that the internet was a passing fad. But you can see these headlines, just very, very negative. It's the criminal's best friend. It's part of the underworld. And this was much more negative than even the early internet days. I mean, the early internet days in the 1990s, you had news anchors who were just kind of confused about the @ and .com and totally dismissing how it would revolutionize our way of communicating. And Bitcoin had a lot of skepticism as well. So let's turn to television. 2013 is also when Bitcoin started to hit the mainstream news waves on air. And I moved from CNN at the time. I was working behind the scenes in my first job after grad school to local reporting on camera that time. But Bitcoin never hit my radar. I was not watching CNBC, unfortunately. But let's listen to how TV anchors covered Bitcoin starting that time. You can roll the video.
Or is it a tulip bulb?
Or is
We're
it
going to
just
debate that.
Bitcoin. You never heard of them a few weeks ago? Now everybody's talking about them, but is it a currency?
I don't know. Or is it more like a stock? Or is it a tulip bulb?
Or is
We're
it
going to
just
debate that.
stupid?
Have you ever heard of Bitcoin? It's a digital currency that's gaining popularity. It exists only online. Tell you the truth, I honestly don't get it. Why not use regular dollars? Well, the man who is behind Bitcoin, that business, he's here, and he'll join us next.
To me, it smells like Ponzi scheme and the greater fool theory right now.
I'll tell you what, I don't know what to do exactly with Bitcoin, and they don't look a bit like these coins. Matter of fact, they're kind of in the Ethernet. What are they?
We have something called the Bitcoin. Now, what's the Bitcoin?
All right, we're going to talk about the cyber threat now. And who's ever heard of the Bitcoin, this underground person-to-person web exchange currency?
It's anonymous and untraceable, so criminals can trade drugs and guns online with Bitcoin.
Now, if you didn't bite at the Bitcoin craze, you may have saved yourself some money. Mary Thompson is here. What was that with the flash crash?
Well, I don't know, Mandy. 2 days ago, of course, the currency was turning heads at $240. Today, investors are turning tail. Bitcoin's value plummeting to a low at she said 54.25 each overnight, a stunning 77% decline, recovering to just over $73 now.
Oh boy. They were off, right? Too bad they weren't buying back then. They probably regret it, or maybe not yet. All right, so I do want to point out that there was a massive exception. During this early period of so much skeptical news coverage, there were a select few who were already publicly recognizing Bitcoin as the future of money. And of course, no one was louder, and no one put their reputations more on the line than Max Kaiser and Stacy Herbert. And I'm sure many of us in this room wish we were lucky enough and wise enough to listen to them back then, because as early as 2011, Max and Stacy were educating the public on the virtues of ethical digital money and calling out central bankers and Wall Street Ponzi schemes. So let's listen to some of their early highlights.
An ancillary trend that I see moving forward in 2012 is the emergence of Bitcoin.
Bitcoin Top 100 Rich List from 3rd of June 2011.
This is fantastic. This is the new Forbes fortune list, isn't it? These are the Bitcoin fortunes. It's pure anonymous, and this is the biggest story of this decade going forward, is the transition from the old way of doing business around the world to the Bitcoin way of doing business, which is purely anonymous. And this is the great achievement of the global insurrection against banker occupation. Bitcoin is the currency of the resistance. Amir Taqi, co-founder of BitcoinConsultancy.com.
I must say that your show was one of the first to start reporting on Bitcoin, and you actually gave a very, very informative coverage of it compared to the later sensationalist news afterwards.
Boy, it feels great to be a Bitcoin millionaire. I'm loving it. Bitcoin has absolutely triumphed as the dollar has crashed 90% against Bitcoin, as Bitcoin is set to take on the world and root out the banksters, as we sorely need. Did I mention how good it feels to be a Bitcoin millionaire?
Yes. And how do you like this rain and snow and construction?
The clouds are opening up to herald the arrival of Satoshi Cyberchrist. Christ is back, and he's got Bitcoin.
For some reason, you know what, I have to just say, there were two clips of Stacey I didn't see in there, so I apologize, because Stacey had also some great call-outs in there, so I'm not sure why the video didn't get updated. But I don't know if they're here, but a huge round of applause. Let's just go for it. I mean, Max and Stacey, they were the first. And I really wish I knew to listen to them back then. I wish I knew about their show. So 2015 and 2016, I won't cover it at length because this is really when a lot of the confusion set in, associating Bitcoin with everything else as more and more of these crypto tokens began to surface in the market. And with the price of Bitcoin at the time in sort of a drawn-out bear market after the dramatic collapse of Mt. Gox, the mainstream media kind of got bored with Bitcoin. So sensationalism turned to apathy, and instead of reporting on Bitcoin, they decided to turn to Bitcoin's promising underlying technology, the blockchain. That's how mainstream media covered it. They looked right past the innovation of Bitcoin, the problem it's trying to solve, and it didn't look at, how perfectly embodied and elevated the properties of money, and instead they decided to fall into the crypto marketing traps, and they reported on the perceived benefits of blockchain. So blockchain, not Bitcoin, became a narrative, and it was clear that they were just not doing their homework. And then came 2017. Bitcoin's price, if you remember, began to rally, and suddenly it was back in the headlines. But that year can be characterized as the time when Bitcoin really broke through and went mainstream on a much larger scale. In 2017 alone, Bitcoin's price ran from $900 to an all-time high of $20,000 at the time. And this is where awareness, again, just grew to levels never before seen. People were getting rich and people were FOMOing. The price action was attributed to the increased mainstream awareness, but the general public also at the time now had access to major exchanges like Coinbase and Kraken. There were also favorable macroeconomic factors like a relatively stable economy, tax cuts, and people were seeing other people getting rich. Fun story, 2017 is the year I got into Bitcoin. I started investing personally, and I was working as a local news reporter for an NBC news station in the capital of California, Sacramento. And so I decided to pitch a story. And they were very reluctant, very hesitant, but they allowed me to do one story. It was on Bitcoin ATMs in the suburban area of Sacramento. And they've since scrubbed it from their website. I can't find the video, unfortunately. They've left only a text Q&A. But I was excited to see that because, it's something that local news started to really report on. And it was on my radar, although I hadn't done my homework fully. All right, so the run-up to $20,000 per Bitcoin resulted in a lot more news coverage. And the rapid rise in price really sparked fears of a big bubble. And unfortunately, it did pop. And that ushered in even more FUD. So you saw headlines that, yep, Bitcoin was a bubble, and it popped. Remember, Bitcoin, some investors might want to forget. Bitcoin has gone beyond the absurdity of the 17th century tulip bulb mania. So all that media personalities were talking about was really the volatility. Tulip bubbles, the crash. There were calls for protecting investors from this very risky asset class. And according to BitcoinObituaries.com, between 2017 and 2018, the Bitcoin is dead. It was declared dead more than 217 times, which was a 2-year record. Little did they know, though, as Bitcoin's price were falling, the true Bitcoiners were saying, this is a great time to buy, and I'm going to keep building. So Bitcoin's price once again went sideways. And in 2019, the crash had become old news. Bitcoin was boring again. News coverage dropped off. And all of that was going to change in a massive way. Suddenly, we were facing a pandemic. It was all hands on deck. I was a news reporter at the time. I was studying Bitcoin, but I was still a full-time reporter. The government, Federal Reserve, pumping trillions of dollars into the market, and everyone was stuck at home. So what did they have? They had time, right, to look into Bitcoin, and they were also flush with stimulus checks. So more and more began to buy it, and that served as fuel for the next bull market, and the media liked to cover it. So let's take a look at some of those headlines. As liquidity flooded the financial system, more and more people began to wake up to Bitcoin's true value proposition, especially as an inflation hedge. The media began to cover the bull run in actually a new light. It was no longer considered a fad or a bubble. It was, quote, winning. And the industry was maturing, and it was becoming embraced by investors around the world. And these are the years when companies like MicroStrategy, Tesla, Block all began allocating Bitcoin to the balance sheet. Large institutional players like BNY Mellon, Fidelity, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase all expanded their Bitcoin products and services to their clients. More than a dozen Bitcoin mining companies went public. Sports stars like Saquon Barkley and Tony Hawk were endorsing Bitcoin. Politicians began developing a strategy for a new voting bloc. And El Salvador became the first nation to make Bitcoin legal tender. So Bitcoin finally arrived on the world's main stage. But as Bitcoin went mainstream, so did cryptocurrency, attempting to benefit off of all of Bitcoin's success. And the flood of easy money really created that environment for excessive speculation. So do you guys remember this? People were spending millions on pictures of frogs and rocks. This one went for 1.3 million. So the signs were really there. And in hindsight, I think it's obvious that the party was not going to last. And no, I'm not bitter about the sats I bought over $60,000 thinking it was going to 100, not at all. But during this time, CPI inflation got out of control. The Fed eventually took away the punch bowl. They raised interest rates. They tried to reduce the balance sheet at one of the fastest paces in history. And what happened next was a massive hangover for the crypto industry and a lot more news to cover with a lot more FUD. So suddenly, like dominoes, all these crypto projects started to fail. And as Warren Buffett wisely has said, once the tide goes out, you see who's swimming naked. And we had a lot of skinny dippers. So Terra Luna took the first dive, Three Arrows Capital, Celsius, Voyager, BlockFi, and then, of course, the big fish, FTX. And then when you think things couldn't get worse, they did. And honestly, it felt like the media was just loving it, right? High drama, the characters, the destruction. And the stories felt like they were writing themselves for these news journalists who, again, at the time, did not understand Bitcoin and what they were saying behind some of these headlines. And the media also focused on the heartbreak stories. In journalism school, I was actually taught if it bleeds, it leads. Negative stories always make the news. So many unsuspecting retail investors, they lost their life savings, and the media covered it. And this tarnished the entire industry, but it blemished Bitcoin's reputation, whether it was warranted or not. And it showed that I think it slowed public acceptance, at least for a little bit, because people were so afraid of the industry, and those who were thinking about investing decided they were not going to do it after all. And then there was the environmental FUD that came. The FUD surrounding Bitcoin, it didn't just fade after the mainstream media covered all of the crypto failures and bursts, and Bitcoin started to rally back up to 30,000. No, they decided to evolve their media coverage to some new FUD. So the latest criticism as of recently was a lot of the environmental FUD. Horrible New York Times, piece that potentially altered the photo to make it look like there was more pollution, the footprint of Bitcoin mining. And according to Bloomberg, Bitcoin is almost as bad for the planet as beef. So great job, guys. So in terms of media's uphill battles and what's next, I think that our two biggest challenges are the media continuing to conflate Bitcoin and crypto and Bitcoin's environmental impact. But we do seem to be making progress. During this bear market, Bitcoin has shined as something unique, especially with all of the regulatory actions. Bitcoin has been the one thing that has regulatory clarity. It's completely different. It is not a security. So that's why I believe we're starting to see a shift in the media narrative. And we also did have recent positive reports saying that Bitcoin is ESG friendly, a positive report from KPMG. So it's starting to turn. And I think what's also helping is Wall Street taking notice and filing some spot Bitcoin ETF applications. So as sentiments begin to shift, I think Bitcoin will also benefit from the faltering traditional financial system, which makes me think of that original headline by Satoshi Nakamoto. The best marketing for Bitcoin is fiat, and the collapsing of fiat currencies and the mismanagement of central banking and weaponizing of currencies. So stories like the ones you see on screen will continue to gain momentum, and as they become more frequent, people are going to search for a solution. But unfortunately, every time I go on the news, you can see I'm right there with Bitcoin, Ethereum, XRP. So we still have some work to do. We have a ways to go, and we need to acknowledge that because it's been 14 years. 88% of people report that they've heard of crypto here in the US, but most still don't own Bitcoin. And fewer understand it, really. Some reports say only between a fraction of a percent to 2% of the globe owns Bitcoin. And one of the reasons is because the mainstream media are just not educated. And the signal can be found on independently run websites, on Bitcoin Twitter, on podcasts, on YouTube. We have a lot of work to go. And part of the responsibility really lies on all of us to educate the people that are in our communities, our circle of friends. So what can we do? You can educate your community. You can educate your friends. You can educate your coworkers, your parents. Every one person makes a difference. Someone told us about Bitcoin. For me, it was friends in San Francisco, and I'm so grateful that I was curious enough to start to study on my own. But someone had to tell me about Bitcoin. Pitch stories to your local news reporters. Wherever you live, whether it's a big city or small, there's a local newspaper, a magazine, a television network. They're constantly looking for stories. Pitch them a Bitcoin story. Contact your local elected officials. Tell them this is important. They always want to be ahead of the news. And generally, politicians now, they know something because they know they need to have an answer. Go to events and bring and invite normie friends. We cannot just be talking to other Bitcoiners. As fun as Bitcoiners are, we need to expand our circles a little bit. Orange pill people with influence, right? So if you know someone who maybe has a bigger reach, maybe they're a speaker, maybe they're a teacher that has a lot of students, maybe they're an influencer, maybe they're an actor, whatever it is, if you can reach people that have a larger audience, that will be more effective because people with large audience have developed trust with those audiences. And if you're interested, create content and work in Bitcoin. I did it on my own, thinking it was just, a passion project, and it turned into a full-time career. But I think we just have to remember that, mainstream media acts as a barometer for public interest. So if Bitcoin remains on the periphery of public interest, then it won't get news coverage. And if we elevate Bitcoin and education, I think we can ignite a real cycle. Heightened awareness will prompt media attention, and in turn, expanded coverage will foster more understanding, and it'll be a dance of supply and demand in the information age. So the narrative will change. Bitcoin will win. Thanks for stopping by. Stay classy, Austin.